Hi guys, welcome to this video for D100 Dungeon, the World Builder game. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to be looking at playing out some of the actions. So if you haven't seen them before, we've been building up on our videos, setting up our World Builder map, and we've been seeing how we generate hexes and how we create our quests and so forth. And now we're at the stage where we've looked over the calendar a bit and we're ready to actually start looking at actions and how they're used in the game. So if you haven't checked them videos out, please check them out first and have a bit of a look at them, because it will get you to this point in the system where we're actually going to start performing some actions. The last video that we did was the calendar video, and we went through how you're going to be spending action points and crossing off days on the calendar, and each time you spend a day performing one of the actions, one of the activities and so forth, we're going to be spending a ration, one of our rations from our calendar sheet. So you begin the game with 15 rations, and your first few action points you're going to be depleting from your rations section there. So one of the things to bear in mind is every time you spend a day doing an activity and you cross off a day on the calendar, you are, as well as doing that activity, it's assumed your adventure is resting. So you're taking some sleep, you're stopping and you're resting. If you wanted to, you could push your adventure a bit harder. They would take a point of fatigue, but they wouldn't do that automatic resting that they're doing and they're performing every time they spend an action point. And they would then, by gaining that point of fatigue and pushing your adventure, the next two action points that you spend, you wouldn't need to spend any rations for. They would be considered to be done during the same day. So you would spend one action point, you wouldn't cross off the next two action points that you did, and you wouldn't need to spend any food either. So basically you would get 3 actions, 3 actions per action day that you spent, performing that action and not taking any rest, but you would gain a point of fatigue. And then when you take a point of fatigue, each time you gain a point you need to make a fatigue test, and you do that by rolling 1d10 equal to or below the number of pips you've got. If you do, then you will suffer 1d 3 health points of damage from your fatigue, and then you would remove 1 point of fatigue from the fatigue track. So that's working pretty similar to how poison works in the dungeon part of the game. So just moving on from there, we're going to look at the actions and how you spend them. So when you're in a hex, you can perform as many actions as you like in any order that you like. Some of them are restricted to the number of times you may be able to perform them. So if we're starting in this hex here, that's where we created our adventurer in the previous video. If we was to forage, the forage activity can only be performed 3 times while you are in that hex. If you move to another hex, you can then perform it 3 times and so forth. Fishing as well, that's another one, and there's a few others as well that will only allow you to perform them a number of times, which is detailed on this sheet here. If it hasn't got a number of times, you can perform them as many times as you like. Okay, so that's the basics of spending and using action points. We're going to look at each action in turn. So the rest action is the first one. We'll go down this list here. Don't know if you can quite see that, but if you've got your world action sheet to hand, we'll look at them and you can follow through them. The rest action and all the other actions are all explained in more detail in the rule book, so you can check them out, and once you've got them sorted and how you actually play them, you probably won't need to refer much to this book at all, and you can just use your cheat sheet here. So getting back to it, we're going to look at the rest action. So you spend 2 action points, 1, 2, and then you will then gain back 1 point of fatigue. So you would remove 1 point of fatigue from your chart there. That's pretty much it for the rest action. The scout action, we would choose any adjacent hex that hasn't yet been generated and generate it. That will cost us 2 action points. So to perform that, we would basically cross off 2 days on the calendar, spend 2 food, and then be able to generate that hex and determine what terrain it was and so forth. We then have the forage action. So there's 3 types of test for foraging. You've got the harvesting test, trapping test and hunting test, and depending on how you would like to perform in the forage test will determine your successes and your failures. So if we look at them one at a time, in the harvesting it says test intelligence minus FP, which is a forage penalty, and we'll explain what that is in a minute. If you're successful, you gain rations plus, and it shows a poor symbol, which is actually a modifier that you get for depending on the time of year it is. And then if you fail when you're harvesting, you will suffer some form of poison, and you would shade in 1d3 poison pips. And the 2 skills that you can use are aware and survival. So let's look at this forage penalty. So depending on what hex you're in, at the moment we're in the mountain hex. On the terrain table in the book, we have a list of different statistics. One of them is a forage penalty, FP, and so what you would do is you would find mountains, and it tells you that your forage penalty is minus 15, but you will gain 7 rations. So after you've made your test, if you was in that particular instance, we would need to take our intelligence and we would need to deduct 15 because we're in the mountain range. Then we'll roll the dice, Dex, roll the dice, add out any bonuses for our skills and so forth. Standard test that you would perform in all of your games. And then if we passed it successfully, we would gain those 7 rations, as we saw on this table here. For mountains, you would gain 7 rations, plus your yearly benefit. So which is your forage bonus. So depending on what time of year it is, you will see that there's a forage bonus. Some of them are negative. So at the moment it's January, so during the months of January we would suffer -2 to a number of rations that we would gain. So because we was in a mountain, we would gain 7 rations if we were successful, but we would then lose 2 because of the time of year, so we would only gain 5 rations. And then you would then add them to your calendar sheet and add 5 to them. So it's pretty sort of very similar to making tests during the normal course of the game. And of course if you roll 10 or less, you're going to gain XP from that as well, in the traditional sense and spirit of the game. The other foraging that you can do is trapping, which is basically a dex test, and you will gain and you use traps and hunting skill. And for hunting, you're going to be using your agility and hunting skill. So and if you failed your trapping or hunting skills, then you will be attacked by a prey monster. And I won't go into details of the combat. Works exactly the same as in a dungeon delve. When you're actually in the dungeons, you add the monsters to your combat track and you fight the monsters. They've got the same opportunities to escape. You roll for their reactions and so forth, and if you manage to defeat the prey monster, then you will gain half of the rations that you would normally have been allowed to have gained if you had passed the test. So in this case we would have gained 5 rations, we would have only gained 2.5, which I think we round down to 2. Yeah, we do, we round down to 2, so you would only gain 2 actual rations if you manage to defeat the monster. So that's pretty much the forage test. Let's look at the next one. So fishing, very similar to fishing. You can only, if you're fishing, you need to have a fishing rod and a line. It costs you 1 action, 1 day of fishing, and you can only perform it 3 times. You need a fishing rod and a line, and you can add some bait, which is optional. If you add bait, then you get a bonus to your fishing test. The only skill that complements fishing is fishing skill, and the test is a dex based test with a minus to your forage penalty if you fail one of your lines breaks and you shade 1 pip of damage on your fishing rod. So you actually need to have a fishing rod which is equipped to the back of your adventure sheet in your backpack area, and it has a damage value and a damage track as well, and it has a gold and a fixed value. And so you would need to have lines that you attach to that fishing rod, and providing you've got both a fishing rod and a line, then you're good to go. You can spend your action point and do some fishing. One of the main parts of the game is finding quests and going off and performing them. So there is a quest action, and it has a variable action point. So when you go off into your dungeon, every time on your adventure sheet that you reach this point on the time track, you're going to be shading 1.1 calendar day on your quest time track. Each time that's refreshed, you keep shading 1 and 1 and 1, and then at the end of the quest, when you've left the dungeon, then you spend 1 action point for each of these that have been shaded, but each one that's got a 1 in that box, I'll show you this a bit close up so you know what we're talking about. So each one of them that we shade in, we're going to be shading in 1 fatigue as well, so you're going to be suffering fatigue. And also you, after the quest, you would refresh that as well. So let me check that I've just told you everything on that. During a quest, spend 1 action point, not rations, and suffer. Yeah, so for each one of them that we shade in, we're going to be crossing off a day on the calendar, and also as well, each one that's got a 1 in it, as well as crossing off a day on the calendar, we're going to be shading a fatigue pip on our track there as well. Okay, so that's how quests and side quests work. Once you're in the dungeon part of the game, once you've taken that and you're mapping and so forth, you're in the hands of the original rulebook, and not a lot else applies from this other than just logging your time on the quest track. Okay, we're going to look at we're going to skip cart and ride for now. We're going to look at the move action. So we're going to get back to the cart and the ride in a moment, because they correspond to moving as well. So let's look at this and try and explain it in a way that's fairly straightforward. So when you move from a hex, you have to follow a move statistic, which is on the terrain sheet. It's also on, in a shorthand, it's on your map key as well. So you can, once you're familiar with the rules, you can just be using this map sheet. You don't need to keep referring to this terrain sheet. So if in the example of, say, the mountains, we're going to be moving from the mountains, and it's going to cost us a base move of 8 action points. So we'd have to spend 8 days crossing off to move out of the mountains and into a generated hex. So you can only move from one generated hex to another generated hex. If it isn't been generated, we couldn't move to these until we've done a scout action. We'd have to scout the area first before we moved into it. So that's quite important. The next thing is depending on roads and rivers, it will affect the amount of action points that you're going to actually be that's going to actually cost you. So if you move from say the mountains and you're moving in the direction of a river, so the way it's flowing, we're going to move from this here to this here, we can see a river's flowing into that area. There wouldn't be a penalty, but let's say this area here was generated. Because we was moving and there wasn't a river flowing to that area, it would now cost us an extra 2 action points. We would have to spend, instead of 8, 10 action points. Right, so now let's consider roads. So if we was in this hex here, and let's say this one was generated here, we would be moving along a road, and it would be more advantageous because we can move quickly along a road. It would save us 2 action points. So we could move from the hills here and move into this hex here if it was generated, and it would give us a reduction of 2 action points. So the hills are normally a base movement of 5 action points. By moving along the road, it would now cost us 3 action points. However, we are crossing a river, and we said before in this example that if you're crossing a river, you're going to be spending more time, and it's going to cost you an extra 2 action points. But when you're following the flow of a road, that doesn't apply. The road counts out the river because the road has been made to cross the river anyway. If we was moving from this section here over to here, there isn't a river flowing and there isn't a road flowing to it, so it would be that minus that plus 2 action points to move. Okay, so that's how you move. You always consider the action points from the area that you're leaving and not the one you're moving to. So you always, if we're in the Mystic Mountains, it's always the mountains that we use on this. The move cost, the action points, the number of action points it's going to cost to move from the mountains to the generated area. Right, now we're going to look at how a cart action impacts that move. Oh, before we do that, also as well, you will be generating sometimes C hexes in these areas, and if you're moving from a C hex, let's just make sure I get this right and I tell you this right. So moving from leaving a C hex, you will have to pay a 60 gold piece fee or suffer the swim event, and that is like a fee to a ship, a captain on a ship. You've had to take a ship across that sea, so it's going to cost you. There isn't a cost to enter the sea hex, but when you leave a sea hex, you're going to have to pay 60 gold pieces, or you will have to suffer a swim event. Right, so I think that covers that base part of moving. We're going to look at the cart action. So if you was in a hex and you wanted to take the cart action, that allows you to try and flag down a cart to move. So let's say we was moving from the Mystic Mountains to the Witch's Hills. First of all, we would have to find whether we could actually find somebody that's heading that way and take us across the mountain range. And so what you would do is you would find your current hex, which is a mountain range, and look up the base population value. And there's also a couple of asterisks here that tell us at the bottom of the table if there's a village, a town or a city, we're going to get a bonus to that percentage chance. And if there's a one or more roads that flows through the hex, we add 10%, or if there's one or more rivers that flows through the hex, we add another 10%. So we can see that the Mystic Mountains does have a river. So it's also got a city. So the city is plus 20%. So our base chance was 30%. Then we add 20 because there's a city, that's 50, and then we add another 10 because there's a river flowing through the hex, so that's 60%. So then you'd go ahead and roll your die. If you rolled 60 or less, then you have found a cart to take you through to the direction that you want to go, and then you'd have to pay the people on the cart that are moving you. So there's a fee that's involved, and that is 1d6 plus 1d10 plus 10 gold pieces. So you would roll these two die. I've got 9 and 5, which is 14, and then we'd add 10 gold pieces, that's 24. That's going to cost us 24 gold to use to hire the cart to take us into the Witch's Hills. Okay, but we can haggle that price. So one of the skills that comes with the World Builder game is the Haggle Skill. And so what we can do is we can make a Haggles test. It's an int based test, and if we're successful we can remove either the d10 or the d6 from the price. In this case we'd remove the 9, so that would mean that the cost to hire that has now gone from 24 to 14. So we'd pay 14 gold pieces and then we would get on the cart. However, if we failed the test, then the highest die roll is doubled, so that would jump up quite significantly. So there is a bit of risk involved. Again, with all tests, if you roll 10 or less, you gain some experience from it. And the advantage of gaining the cart action, taking the cart action, is that you immediately then make a move action and may reduce its cost by 3 action points, but only if you pay for the fee. So as long as we paid the cart the gold that was required, then we get to take a move action and deduct 3 from its final action point cost. So if we go back to our move action here, I think we determined that our move was going to be 8 action points to move from here, because we're moving in the flow of the river. We would actually get to remove 3 from that, so it only cost us 5 to move from there to there if we flagged down a cart and moved. Okay, now we're going to move on to the ride action, which is very similar to the cart action in as much as it's going to reduce our action point cost. You need a mount to do the ride action. In the game there's a mount sheet that you will get to print off. In your first few games you're not really going to have a mount, so we're probably going to mounts in a lot more detail on another video, but basically there's mounts like horses and mules and camels and more extravagant mounts that you can actually find in the game and buy and gain. And each mount you might get the opportunity to slot a bag in, which will give you ways of carrying more equipment around with you on your travels. However, they do cost rations, and if you don't feed them they start suffering from malnutrition as well. So there's little things like that that have some negatives. So you can hold up to 6 mounts at a time, and as long as you've got a mount you can then perform the riding test. If you pass it successfully, and there's a ride penalty, so different terrain is more difficult to ride through. In the mountains for instance we've got -20 to the test, and we make a dex based test. We would deduct 20 from our dex. If we were successful of the test, then we would get to remove 3 action points from our move. So once you've made your ride test you immediately make a move action, and it's going to cost you 3 If you're successful, you're going to be able to reduce that move action by 3 points. If you fail, you will still get to remove it by 2 action points from the total cost, but you've fallen off and you will suffer 1d3 health points of damage. So there's advantages to owning a mount and using it. The travel is significantly improved wherever you travel to and from. Okay, so and that move reduction is made after any deductions for roads and so forth. And I would say that sometimes when you move, because you're in a certain area and you've moved along a road and you're riding, it will reduce your action point total to less than 1, to 0 or below, but all movement will cost you at least a 1 movement point, 1 action point. So it's always going to take you a day, no matter if you happen to be able to get the rules to bend to allow you to move less than a day. It's still going to cost you 1 day, so that's the minimum move cost. Okay, so I think that's covered movement. The ride action and the cart action can only be performed when you're not in a C hex or entering a C hex. And that's about it. Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at lay of the land. So lay of the land, you choose any non-adjacent hex not yet generated. So this is to ask the population for far off hexes and to actually try and find out what's in those hexes and generate them. If you're looking for these ones, then you would use the scout action. So any adjacent hexes that haven't been discovered, you would use your scouting tool. Any non-adjacent hex, you would then use your the lay of the land, and you can do that once while you're in that hex. Okay, so to do that, basically you find your population percentage for the current hex you're in. Let's say we're in the mountains. Again, we've got a 30% chance, but because of the population bonus, because there's a city and a river flowing through it, we get to add 20 for the city and another 10 for the river, so that makes that 60 again. And then we would roll that. But each hex in between, so let's say we was trying to find the lay of the land, we was trying to find out what this hex was here for whatever reason. Each space in between those two hexes, the hex we're in and our target hex, reduces that by 5%. So there's 2 of them, so it reduces it by 10%. So now we need to roll, instead of 60 or less, we need to roll 50 or less, because it's further away, less people in that population area knows much about what's going on in this area there. Then you roll the D100. If you roll equal to or less, which we did do, then the population fill us in, the folk that living in this area are able to tell us about this hex, and then we detail it and we generate that hex in the usual way. So and then you go to the generating the hex section in there. Okay, so right, news of quests. Okay, so for this one, what we do is we generate it costs you 1 action point. You can perform it once time while you're in this in your current hex, and it works in a very similar way to lay of the land. What you do is you find your current hex, modify the population chance by -5 for each hex in between the target. So if we'd managed to succeed that and we generated that hex there, we could then go ahead and check out for news of a quest in that area. And if we did roll equal to or less, we could then start generating a quest in that hex. Okay, so that's how you can find hexes. There's other ways in the game of finding, that's one of the ways you can find quests. There's other ways that you can find quests in the game, but that one there is a common way to build up your quest log on the back, is by searching for news of quests. Okay, the next one is make a camp. It costs you 2 action points, and you can perform it once when you're in a hex. And basically what you do is you would just add a triangle. So it has to, the camp symbol has to be placed in your current hex. So if we was in the Mystic Hills and we wanted to spend 2 action points, we could go ahead and add a by basically adding a camp icon, and then you would cross off 2 days on your calendar and spend 2 food. So I'm going to change that to 13. So we've gone ahead and we've spent 2 days making a camp, and we spent 13 and we spent 2 action points, and then we've placed the camp symbol in our current hex. When you've performed that, you can only have 1 camp symbol per hex, so you can't have multiple camps. Okay, and that moves on to the last one, which is a camp and settlement action. And again, you can only perform that 1 time each time you're in a hex. And whenever you're in a hex with a village, a town, a city, or a camp, excuse me, you may perform a modified version of the before your next quest phase. And what we're going to do is our next video is going to be having a look at the settlement phase, because it's a little bit more involved than the standard before your next quest phase. So we're going to do a video on that, and we're going to look into that in the next one. Okay, so I hope it's been quite a long video this. I hope I've explained it quite well. I was getting pretty tired going through some of the actions, so if I haven't explained anything too well, please put in the comments below anything that I haven't, that you'd like a bit more info on, and I'll try and back it up with some information on how things would play out and work out. But pretty much that covers all of the actions for the World Builder game. Like I say, next video we're going to do is going to be all about settlements. So if you're still with us and you're still enjoying the videos, do join me for that one and check that out. And thanks for watching. Until next time.